of power. And so it allows us basically to perform the revolutions which Thomas Jefferson more or less advocated, bloodlessly, without violence, without any disturbance whatsoever. The people can author law, and so we are, all of us who sign this mandate. Section 1.1, Necessity and Authority. Any law which cannot or has not withstood a process genuinely exposing its entirety first to public affirmation and then to regular public reaffirmation, for the most fundamental irregularities, therefore, cannot rightly be considered to derive from the consent of the people. Moreover, as the only reason to avoid such strictures is the desire to abuse power, evasion betrays the only and therefore generally criminal reasons for lack of such processes. Likewise, any law to be intelligently approved as a universal and enduring supreme conduit of justice must explicitly establish a whole body perpetually justifying its existence, including declarations of the necessities which compel its establishment, declarations and proof of supreme objects, and declarations and proofs of supreme means to achieve and secure those supreme objects. These likewise must finally be subjected not only to formal public affirmation, but to disproof, refinement, and periodic reaffirmation, for nothing less can ever comprise the most desirable conduits of justice, and nothing less than the most desirable refinement of perpetually ascended justice is justice at all under ostensibly representative government. Amidst a vast abuse of power, and to forever close the present avenues for abuse of power, we the people, therefore, as the first and final instruments of actual representation, hereby require proof of necessity and of supreme means to secure supreme objects as indispensable and ever challengeable requisites for all recognized law. And so must this, our mandate and governing law, meet the standards which it imposes on future development and recognition of law, in itself declaring its means, objects, and the necessities which compel its existence. With the present global abuse of power being itself so observant of a fact that no intelligent person would ever dream an ever unassented preservation of terminal exploitation will save us from terminal exploitation. With the dependence, therefore, on disinformation, confusion, and denial of a fact of actual solution explaining a necessary orchestration of evasion by every perpetrator, with the one indispensable power of the present global exploitation being obfuscation of the currency, and therefore with the principal purpose of usurpation being exploitation of the world by an intentional and inseparable subversion of government and currency, which can only multiply artificial indebtedness in proportion to capacity to service debt. with the inevitable consequence of this process being terminal artificial indebtedness and dispossession, with this consequence of that irreversible process now upon us, with its continuance thus ensuring terminal failure, with the ever abusive intention that we suffer these consequences already proven by decades of persistent resistance to a proof of one mathematically perfected economy, which not only solves the purposed injustices of pretended economy immediately and without cost, but which immediately and necessarily eradicates the entire phenomenal sum of present artificial costs which ensure the present failure. With the obvious reason for this denial of representation being that the injustices which must be eradicated are the very goals of the present abuse of power. With every abusive power on earth, therefore, necessarily destroying representation to persist in this terminal exploitation, with every usurpation prevailing not by conclusive argument, neither even by willful submission to knowledgeable public assent, but rather, and even intently, by no more than evasion, and with all this amounting to a practically inconceivable criminal denial of representation to virtually all people, no alternative therefore remains but for the people of the world to immediately retake our sovereign command over every government, that no power whatever can exist but to sustain the only common and necessary objects of the people. Section 1.2, the title of which is Means and Fact of Prevailing Authority. We, the people, therefore exercise our ever-prevailing authority to limit the absolute bounds to which we may be known subject, to prescribe the nature, duration, quality, and irrefutably common objects of the only laws, requirements, interaction, economy, or government which can ever lawfully bear upon us, to require in all public affairs official prior declaration of purpose and intent, to require prior proof of the necessity of each, to require prior assent to these initial declarations as the only lawful authority for government to develop legislation, to require public affirmation and regular periodic reaffirmation of any eventual resultant power, regulation, or act, with every said requirement being entirely sufficient to eradicate any recognizable injustice immediately and without further detriment to any person, to require perpetual public reviewability and full accountability, sufficient even for any and every just individual, to refine, to rightly deny, and even to terminate every injustice against us. We therefore duly criminalize abuse of power, and necessarily we provide to prosecute every purpose, intention, or action which is obstructive, evasive, or destructive to common justice, or to a prosperity which cannot exist without this justice. So we declare these our undeniable reasons, and we secure a necessary fact not only of a common prevailing authority, but of individual prevailing authority, by a fact that ostensibly just consensual rule can only exist by a potential recognition of justice, which is only ultimately reflected by a majority, if and only if a just majority ultimately exists by itself, resolving justice to one enduring conclusion, which only concurs with reasoning which is neither different, better, nor more potent than that of a just individual. By this very principle, we therefore claim and establish immediately our individual rights to mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, however potentially recognized by others. We further claim in its consequences that indifference to these vital objects is an offense against every just person, that under the present circumstances it produces the same consequences as opposition. We therefore claim that to seize such criminal and destructive offenses against us, that as a fact of willful allegiance, every person who refuses to join this mandate is responsible for dissolving from their immediate and future possession the full measure not only of the public obligations to which they have thus ascribed and not paid, but to further resolve from their immediate and future possession every cost and consequence which has artificially sustained the present exploitation to our present and further detriment. In other words, if you stand for the economy that exists, fine, pay its costs. According to these standards of absolute consensual representation, then, so too do we prove our only and necessary means to this justice. For the aforesaid are indeed the very means by which the present crimes are perpetrated. Section 1.3. Facts of crimes against the people and singular solution of pretended economy. As I read this, I'm going to mention, some of the enumerations, but not all of them, because it will make for difficult listening. Section 1.3.1. Only a regulation of an immutable, perpetually representative currency, which at all times sustains and reflects any and every natural vacillation of desirable prosperity according to contribution, so as at all times the resultant circulation immutably represents all actual commitments and all natural consumption and depreciation of property, comprises a circulation which is stripped of possible offense against anyone. Therefore, any deviation from these principles is to endow a power to perpetrate offense, and purposed deviation from this recognizable principle is a criminal offense, destructive not only to the monetary system itself, but to its obligations and to the possession of money or property by every subject. Thus, as proportion and disposition are the only means of